topic, which is movies. And I have a lot of catching up to do in terms of the movies that I've seen actually over the 2-week break, Christmas and New Year's, because both of those happen to fall on a Tuesday, and the Boston Free Radio studios were shut down. Even if they weren't shut down, I still would opt out of doing my show at least for Christmas because, come on, it's the holidays. But in any event, I do have a running list of movies that are relatively new, but I haven't seen yet. 5 of them I will review for this show, but first I'm going to get to my first segment, which is What's Topping the Box Office. These are the top 10 highest grossing films of this past weekend. And this comes as somewhat of a surprise to me. The number one movie at the box office this week is The Upside, which, a little bit of a spoiler alert, has outseated Aquaman in the number one spot at the box office for the first time in Aquaman's 4-week run. But it's not entirely surprising considering that Aquaman's 3 weeks old and it can't stay at the top for too long, especially considering the January movies that are coming in. And of course, Kevin Hart has proven himself to be a box office draw. So this weekend it grossed $20.4 million here at home, and by at home I mean in the States and Canada. And that is against a budget of $37.5 million. So while The Upside is not a hit yet, the fact that it grossed $20.4 million in 3 days is a really good start. I don't have any numbers for you internationally for how The Upside did. Aquaman is still doing really well for itself, despite the fact that it's number 2 at the box office. This past weekend, it grossed a decent $17.4 million. Against a budget ranging from $160 to $200 million, Aquaman has so far made $287.9 million here at home. Around the world, though, it has grossed a staggering $1.02 billion, and that's after being out for just a month. So it's a tentative hit here at home, but around the world it is a certified hit by a lot. A Dog's Way Home is the second highest grossing debut movie of the week. The first highest grossing is, of course, The Upside. A Dog's Way Home grossed $11.3 million here at home this weekend, and that's against a budget of $18 million. So it's grossed more than half of its budget back already, which is a very, very good start. I don't have the international numbers for you for this movie, however. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is doing extremely well critically and commercially. When I reviewed it before taking the holiday break, I gave it my rating of a knockout, and I do not take that back. A lot of people are considering this the best Spider-Man movie ever. I'm not going to go that far, but it is a great movie. But this past weekend, it grossed $9.1 million. This is its 5th weekend release against a budget of $90 million, which may actually make it the cheapest Spider-Man movie ever made. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse has so far grossed $147.8 million here at home and $302.4 million abroad, or rather in every country including the United States and Canada, not necessarily abroad. But in any event, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is so far a tentative hit here at home and a certified hit around the world, and I actually thought I'd be doing better, especially against Aquaman, but I'll get more into that later. Escape Room has been out for 2 weeks. In its second week in release, it's number 5 at the box office, sliding from number 2 last week, having grossed $8.9 million at the home box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $9 million, which is minuscule, Escape Room has so far grossed $32.5 million here at home and $35 million around the world, making it a certified hit here in the States and around the world. Mary Poppins Returns has also been out for 4 weeks along with Anchorman and Bumblebee, and it grossed $7.7 million at the home box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $130 million, Mary Poppins Returns has so far grossed $151.1 million here at home and $288.4 million worldwide, making it a tentative hit here at home and a certified hit all around the world, so it's doing very well for itself. Bumblebee, which is the 6th Transformers movie, the 6th in 12 years, if you can believe it, is also doing pretty well for itself, although not nearly as well as Aquaman. Last week, Bumblebee was number 4 at the box office. This week, it slid all the way to number 7, having grossed $7.2 million at the home box office. Against a budget of $100 to $137 million, somewhere in that range, Bumblebee has so far grossed $108.9 million here at home, and $367 million around the world, making it a tentative hit here at home, just inching its way to a tentative hit, but around the world it is already a certified hit. On the Basis of Sex, which is the movie about one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's landmark cases as a lawyer before she became a Supreme Court justice, is number 8 at the box office. And this is the only movie to climb from its previous spot last week, which was at number 16. But because of its worldwide release in most theaters, On the Basis of Sex grossed $6.1 million, which is a record for it in its 3-week run. Against a budget of $20 million, On the Basis of Sex has so far grossed $10.4 million here at home and an indeterminate amount around the world, which means it is not a hit yet, but for a movie that just opened to theaters nationwide, if not worldwide, it's off to a pretty good start. The Mule, starring Clint Eastwood, and directed by Clint Eastwood, I should say, is number 9 at the box office, falling from number 6 last week, having grossed $5.7 million at the domestic box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $50 million, that's $50 million, The Mule has so far grossed $90.7 million here at home and $94.3 million around the world, making it a tentative hit here at home and around the world. And finally, number 10 at the box office is Vice, which fell from number 7 last week in its 3-week run, having grossed $3.2 million here at home. Against a budget of $60 million, Vice has so far grossed $35.9 million here at home and $40.4 million around the world, which means it's not a hit yet here in the States or around the world.
To protect her home and family in a disaster, Karen was willing to wade through water, mud, and insurance paperwork.
Yeah, I can do this.
You go, Karen! By simply understanding and updating what her insurance covers and doesn't cover now, she'll be better prepared no matter when disaster strikes. Learn other simple ways to protect your home and family before a natural disaster at ready.gov. That's ready.gov. A message from FEMA and the Ad Council.
Listen to She Likes It Heavy on Tuesdays at 10 p.m. Eastern on BostonFreeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The first movie I'm going to be reviewing is The Upside, which is the latest film starring Kevin Hart and Bryan Cranston. It's directed by Neil Berger, who hasn't had too much experience directing comedies. He's directed previously Interview with the Assassin, which is about a man who makes a startling claim about the JFK assassination. He also directed The Illusionist, starring Edward Norton, Jessica Biel, and Paul Giamatti, which was a pretty good movie. And last but not least, the last theatrically released film he directed was Divergent, which was pretty well received when it was the first movie, but the previous sequels hadn't been as well reviewed. But Neil Berger hasn't actually directed the sequels to Divergent. So in any event, The Upside is a remake of a very well received French film called The Intouchables. And that is not actually me saying the word incorrectly. It's actually called Intouchables, not Untouchables. And it was a film that was pretty well received. It was a big box office hit in France, and it was such a very well-received film that it was actually remade 3 times, twice before this one, into an Indian film called Upiri, which I haven't seen. I don't see many Indian films. And also an Argentinian film, which was called Inseparables. And both those films came out in 2016. So The Upside is actually a little bit of a positive for me because I haven't seen the original, so I can't probably compare the two unfavorably. I can just view the upside for what it is. And for what it is very funny and extremely well acted. It's a comedic look at the relationship between a wealthy man with quadriplegia, who in this movie is played by Bryan Cranston. Bryan Cranston's character's name is Philip Lacasse, and his previously unemployed assistant with a criminal record who is hired to help him. And that assistant is named Del Scott, and he's played in this movie by Kevin Hart. And we don't actually see Del Scott in prison, or we don't even get the reason why he's in prison or had a previous criminal record until later in the film. But then again, we also don't know why Bryan Cranston's character is quadriplegic until later on in the film as well. He wasn't born this way, but he has a quadriplegia where he's not able, not only not to move his legs, which is obvious, but he's also not able to move his arms. Basically, he's able to move everything from the neck up, maybe even the chest up, really, but with the chest up, there's really not much to move there. But some quadriplegics actually do have motor in their arms, but they're not able to close their hands. In fact, there's a brilliant documentary that's called Murder Ball, which is about quadriplegics, some of whom got injured in car accidents, others whom received quadriplegia as a result of diseases like polio, for instance. It's a fascinating documentary, but on this movie, before I get too off kilter, but in any event, Kevin Hart is struggling as an ex-convict. He has a son and an ex-wife from whom he's estranged, and he is not particularly enthusiastic about going out there and trying to find another job, but he knows he has to in order to meet the demands of his parole. So eventually he goes to a building owned by the wealthy Philip Lacasse, who again is Bryan Cranston's character, and initially he's going there to work as a custodian for the building, but then he inadvertently comes for an interview, and even though he is not qualified, Philip Lacasse hires him pretty much on the spot, despite the objections of his personal assistant, Yvonne Pendleton, who's played very well in this movie by Nicole Kidman. So, of course, it is a fish out of water story about a guy from the streets of New York City who finds himself going from, I think, Queens or Brooklyn or one of those less ostentatious boroughs of New York going into Manhattan and doing just about everything that needs to be done for this quadriplegic man who can afford the help, but of course it is quite inconvenient that he has to rely on other people. And there are certainly a lot of funny moments. I loved Kevin Hart and Bryan Cranston in this movie. I thought they made a really good team. They had appropriate chemistry together, and by appropriate I mean that when they first come together, of course you would imagine that Kevin Hart's character would have a hard time adjusting, especially given his character, and of course he and Bryan Cranston's character have nothing in common, but eventually they develop a friendship that is actually really touching. And I didn't have actually a lot of bad things to say about this film. It does certainly follow a story arc where the two of them eventually come together as strangers. They don't really have that much in common, but then eventually they begin to form an interesting friendship. I thought actually one of the most touching scenes in the film is when Bryan Cranston's character brings Kevin Hart's character to an opera. And of course, you would imagine that Kevin Hart would have no interest in opera, and certainly this movie meets that expectation. But then there's a certain aria that Kevin Hart hears, and the way that the camera shows how Kevin Hart is immersed in this opera show is very funny and also very sweet at the same time. And I think this movie works on a lot of levels. As I said before, I can't compare it favorably or unfavorably to The Intouchables, the 2011 movie on which it's based. But because of this movie, I'm actually very interested in seeing the original Intouchables, and I'm not quite sure when I'm going to have time to do that, especially given that it's the beginning of the year and it's Oscar season, and I have a lot of other films on which to catch up with you guys, but that is another story for another time. I didn't expect very much from The Upside. Kevin Hart's been kind of hit or miss in comedies, but Bryan Cranston has chosen his roles a lot more carefully, and I think the two of them make a wonderful pair in this film. And it gets my rating of a knockout, because this was a lot better of a movie than I expected coming from a Kevin Hart film that's released in January. It wasn't bad. It wasn't nearly as tedious as I expected. I really enjoyed The Upside, and I think you will too if you see it.
Melissa from Michigan. I work an extra part-time job serving lunch at my child's school, but I still can't afford to put food on our table.
Daniel from California. Choosing whether to pay the rent or pay to fix the car to get to work doesn't leave us with much at all. Now we can't even pay for meals.
Hunger is a story we can end. End it at feedingamerica.org. Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Never Stop the Madness, Tuesdays at 9 p.m. BostonFreeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Aquaman, and I'm a little bit late to the party here, but to be fair, I didn't actually see Aquaman for the previous show I did because it hadn't come out yet. And the movie hadn't been pre-screened for critics either. But Aquaman came out the weekend after my last show for 2018. And I'm playing a little bit of catch up now, especially considering that Aquaman is doing incredibly well at the box office. It is the 6th installment in what's called the DC Extended Universe, the DCEU for short. The first film in the DCEU was Man of Steel, followed by Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League, and of course, Aquaman coming out this year. And all the films in the DC Extended Universe, except for Wonder Woman, I should say, have been relatively not terribly received, but kind of given a lukewarm reception. But there will be other movies in the DC Extended Universe, and I could elaborate more upon how the DC Extended Universe has hit the ground stumbling, unlike Marvel, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to judge Aquaman on its merits alone. And truth be told, it was a better movie than I expected it to be. I was a little let down from the previous DCEU movies, particularly, I haven't seen Man of Steel, but Batman vs. Superman, Suicide Squad, and Justice League had some very evident flaws. Wonder Woman was a really great film. As I recall, I think it was probably one of my favorite films of 2017, or if it wasn't in my top 10, it probably was in honorable mention. But Aquaman is probably not as good as Wonder Woman, but it is so far slightly better than the other DCEU movies. And the film, of course, revolves around Aquaman, also known by his Earth name, Arthur Curry, who learns that he is the heir to the underwater kingdom of Atlantis and must step forward to lead his people and be a hero to the world. So watching this film, I could already tell that this movie probably was victim of several rewrites, because I got the part of the movie where Arthur, who is sort of half man, half sea person, or whatever you call the citizens of Atlantis, who are humans, not mermaids, but can still speak and breathe underwater. But in any event, I could tell from watching this film and from the utter confusion of the plot, other than the one I just mentioned to you, that this film had gone through probably rewrite after rewrite after rewrite. The screenplay was written by David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick, he has a very long name, and Will Beal, based on a story by Jeff Johns, James Wan, who directed the film, and Will Beal. And I have the feeling that producers put their hands on this movie and probably rewrote it 20 to 30 times, because there is a lot in this film that is somewhat convoluted from the various plot devices in this film. And also, I wasn't particularly impressed by the acting in this film either. I thought the special effects, particularly those underwater, were great. As a matter of fact, I thought the CGI on the sea creatures themselves, whether real or fictional, was very top-notch. But the acting by many of the people in the film was not great. I thought the best actors in the film, bar none, were Jason Momoa, who plays Arthur / Aquaman, Willem Dafoe, who plays his Atlantean trainer, Vulko, and also Nicole Kidman, who plays his sea-bearing mother, Atlanta. Atlanta is the actual queen of Atlantis. And one thing that I think this movie could have done better is establish what exactly it is that Aquaman can do, because somebody like me has not read the DC comics. So I know that Aquaman can talk and breathe underwater, and I know that he can swim really fast. He's very adept when underwater, but I wasn't sure what the rules of him were when he was on land, because he is part human and also part sea person. His mother is, of course, the sea person, and his father is Tom Curry, who's played in this movie by a pretty good actor by the name of Tamura Morrison. But I didn't understand what it was that made him a hybrid, and if he had to spend certain amount of time under sea, or if he suffocated at all when he was on land. I just didn't know, and the movie didn't really make that clear, because there were some times where he was resistant to being stabbed or shot, and then there were other times where he was stabbed really easily by an arch nemesis. One of them is a guy by the name of Manta, who is a human who's played in this movie by Yahya Abdul Mateen II, who is avenging the death of his father, who we see earlier in the film. But the primary plot is Arthur's fight with his brother King Orm, or his half-brother King Orm, who's played in this movie by Patrick Wilson. And Patrick Wilson is a good actor, and I thought he was good in this movie as well. But what was interesting about him is there's one point where he's wearing a helmet, he takes it off, and he has blonde hair that's kind of slicked back. And I'm not sure if this was the intention of the filmmaker, I doubt it, but I thought that Patrick Wilson, whenever he had the helmet and he took it off underwater, he kind of looked like Eric Trump. And it's just an amusing coincidence. But there's also a relationship between Arthur and another sea-bearing human by the name of Mara, who is played in this movie by Amber Heard. And Amber Heard in this movie looks amazing, particularly with that red hair, but I didn't think her acting was very good. And the chemistry between her and Jason Momoa was kind of hit or miss as well. I was actually intrigued by the fact that Dolph Lundgren is in this movie as King Nereus, who is not a citizen of Atlantis, but is in the vicinity and certainly has dealings with the city of Atlantis. But I can't say I was overly disappointed with Aquaman. Just like Wonder Woman, this should have been the movie that the DC Extended Universe made first, but it gets my rating of a checkout because I love Jason Momoa as Aquaman. I'd love to see him in a sequel.
Okay, forest animals, kids are coming to the forest, and it's up to us to make their visit a good one. Sparrow, have you practiced the most popular bird songs for the year?
Of course.
catchy. I like it. River, how's the temperature?
It's a refreshing 52 degrees, man.
I love it. Turtle.
He's not here yet, man.
He's late every morning. Okay. Squirrel.
The Forest has been preparing just for you. To learn more about cool things to do in the forest, visit discovertheforest.org. Brought to you by the U.S. Forest Service and the Ad Council.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Future Perfect Radio. My name is Tax. I got my man Byron the Poet with me.
What up, what up? It's okay, you can quote it.
I got my man Zanza with me.
Yo, it's your boy.
Coming to you live and direct every Thursday, 8:30 to 10, live on Boston Free Radio, the dopest show going over gaming, sports, and current events. Also, check us out on Spotify. See you guys later.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is A Dog's Way Home, which is based on a book that came out in 2017, written by W. Bruce Cameron, who also wrote the book that was the basis for the movie A Dog's Purpose, which came out in, well, it was a 2010 novel. And the film came out actually last year. So W. Bruce Cameron seems to be kind of like I just completely forgot the author's name. I'm blanking on it. I'm going to move on. But in any event, he is a guy who writes books from dogs' perspectives. And A Dog's Way Home is a movie they optioned into a movie, or rather a book they optioned into a movie very fast. It's a movie that's told from the perspective of a dog, in this case a young pit bull, and it is about how a certain eager dog catcher is forced to, or rather the dog is being forced to separate from the family who adopted her because of an over-eager dog catcher. And the dog lives in Denver, Colorado, where apparently, at least in this cinematic universe, there's an ordinance that prohibits pit bulls from being kept as pets. So because of this, the pit bull is sent to a nearby relative's home in New Mexico, because remember, Colorado and New Mexico are bordering states. So it's far, but it's not too far. But eventually the dog grows anxious and eventually embarks on a journey to, as the title of the movie implies, find her way home. And they seem to use in this movie a mixture of a real dog as well as some CGI animation. The CGI animation is pretty good, but sometimes you can tell the difference between the real dog and the CGI dog, so it's sort of hit or miss. The voice of the dog, whose name is Bella, is Bryce Dallas Howard, who I thought was a really good voice for a very naive young pup who's still trying to find her way in the world. Although sometimes I thought that while this wasn't entirely Bryce Dallas Howard's fault, I did think that some of the narration told a little too much. Sometimes it was adorable and filled in some necessary plot gaps, but then other times I found Bryce Dallas Howard's voiceover kind of stating the obvious. But in any event, it is a cute movie, and you certainly are rooting for the dog. And also, there are various people and animals that Bella befriends, as you might imagine from this movie. And this is a movie that I think if Walt Disney were alive, he would have... Of course, that's not really an option, because if he were alive today, he would be 103. But again, this is the kind of movie that Walt Disney Studios would have done back in the 50s and 60s, and did do with a movie like The Incredible Journey, which they remade in the 90s, called Homeward Bound: The Incredible Journey. And the original Incredible Journey actually had no voiceover dialogue. In other words, it just showed the animals trying to get back to their original family, and there was no voiceover, but that changed with Homeward Bound when the animals actually had voiceover talent. And I could get into who voiced over whom in that film, but again, we're focusing on A Dog's Way Home here. And I thought it was a cute film, and certainly W. Bruce Cameron has kind of carved a niche for himself in terms of books and movies from doing these films based on a pup's perspective. And also, W. Bruce Cameron might be a Christian writer in disguise, even though A Dog's Way Home does not deal with any blatant Christian themes. But one of the producers of this movie, one of several producers, was actually T.D. Jakes, who's the evangelist and bishop who you might see on cable TV every now and then. Unlike most televangelists, he is usually the better one, but the fact that he's actually producing this movie probably says that there might be some religious undertones, but they weren't particularly obvious to me. And I also liked many of the performances in this movie. Of course, you have Ashley Judd in the film as the woman who humans know as Terry, but Bella knows as Mother. You also have a very brief appearance by Edward James Olmos as a homeless veteran by the name of Axel, whom Bella befriends. And there are some other appearances in this movie from some familiar faces. Actually, probably one of the most familiar faces of somebody whose name I didn't actually know was Alexandra Shipp, who was in the movie Straight Outta Compton. She was in X-Men Apocalypse, taking over the role of Storm for Halle Berry, and she was also in Love, Simon, and that's probably where I knew her last. But in any event, A Dog's Way Home is a cute movie. I wouldn't exactly call it a great movie. It was a tad bit predictable, and some of the acting was a little stiff here and there. Plus, Bryce Dallas Howard's voiceover told probably a lot more than she needed to in some instances. But again, that's not Bryce Dallas Howard's fault. That's more the screenwriter's fault. But, you know, it's a minor grievance. This movie is directed by Charles Martin Smith, who's a good director in his own right, and he certainly has had a number of films that pertain to, or rather, what's the word I'm trying to say? That are geared more towards children. That's a great term, including both Dolphin Tale movies. And he's a good actor in his own right, having appeared in American Graffiti, The Untouchables, Deep Impact, and several other movies. But A Dog's Way Home, how did I feel about it? It gets my rating of a checkout. I think it's a very harmless movie. It's not overtly Christian or religious, which is great, because one of my big problems with A Dog's Purpose was that it had those flagrant Christian themes, and also the dog in the film got reincarnated 6 times and was just saying, oh, well, I guess I'm another dog now. But A Dog's Way Home has fewer plot holes than that.
180 over 111, and I had a stroke. I couldn't speak or walk.
150 over 90, and I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure sounds like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from silent. Get back on your treatment plan or talk with your doctor to create a plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
Head to toe, everything's changed.
Brought to you by the American Stroke Association, American Medical Association, and the Ad Council.
You want free speech? I got your free speech right here. It's all about free speech, baby. BostonFreeRadio.com.
to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Escape Room, which is the first mainstream movie to come out in 2019. And I didn't have very high expectations for this one. It's not a great movie, but it's a much better movie than I expected it to be, given that it is a mystery, horror, suspense film that's come out in January. Usually that's kind of the dumping pile January is for the horror films that are really, really bad. I'm not saying that all horror films that come out that are bad come out in January, but a vast majority of them do. In fact, I think there were two on my worst list of 2018 that were just absolutely bad, but Escape Room was actually a better film than I thought it would be. So, as you might expect, it is a film about 6 people, all of whom are strangers, who find themselves in circumstances beyond their control and must use their wits to survive. To be more specific, these are 6 strangers who are invited to an escape room in order to get clues like you would in an escape room scenario that's been popping up and has been incredibly popular over the last couple of years in various cities. And they try to go around the room to find clues in order to escape from a particular room. And they find that actually once they get out of a room, they find themselves into another room. But the reason they're so motivated to get out of this room is because, of course, their lives are on the line. But if they succeed, they actually get $10,000 for their efforts. And there are certain archetypal characters who are in this film. Who are in the scenario. There is a young college student who's shy but brilliant. Her name is Zoe, and she's played by a beautiful young actress named Taylor Russell, who I've seen in a few other films, or rather, actually, she's been in the TV series Lost in Space, which is on Netflix right now. She's been in a couple of movies, but this is probably her breakthrough role. You also have a kid who's working in a grocery store as a college dropout and is trying to get his life back together. His name is Ben. He's played by Logan Miller. You have a kid you actually have an executive who is put into this scenario. His name is Jason, and he's played by Jay Ellis. You have a trucker who needs the money in order to start a new life and new career because of automated driving cars that might put him out of business. His name is Mike, and he's played by Tyler Labine. You have an Iraqi war veteran with a chip on her shoulder by the name of Amanda Harper, who's played by a beautiful actress by the name of Deborah Ann Wall. And finally, you have an escape room nerd who is very good at escape rooms. His name is Danny Kahn, and he's played by Nick Dodani. So you have all 6 of these people vying for $10,000, and they're brought into this escape room anonymously by somebody who you don't exactly know who it is, and they are trying to escape not only for this money, but also ultimately for their lives. Now, that would have been a scenario that I could have written for you and included on IMDb other than the one I wrote, other than the one I read, but I digress. So I thought actually the escape rooms in this film were very creative, very suspenseful, and because of my fear of heights, there's one particular escape room to which these contestants escape that involves actually dangling from a very high distance. And during that entire scene, which had the song Downtown by Petula Clark playing in the background, my palms were sweating profusely. And I know that if I ever hear the song Downtown by Petula Clark ever again, I'm going to think of that scene. But the only thing I didn't really like about Escape Room was that even though it is capitalizing upon something that's becoming increasingly popular, especially amongst tourists, I kind of get that connection. But what I didn't like about it was it didn't really try to distance itself from other horror suspense films that are similar to this one, such as Saw, for instance. And I think one of the ways it could have separated itself from Saw was not to make the puppet master, or shall we say the observer of these 6 people struggling to go from room to room and ultimately escape, so much like the character of Jigsaw. And no, the character who's the overseer in Escape Room is not represented by a creepy puppet, but still has the same kind of motivations as the overseer, who's not revealed until the very end, like the one in Saw, and also the one in the Chernobyl Effect, which also was an imperfect variation on Saw, but was also very suspenseful. But I really love the acting in this movie. I loved the escape rooms in this film, every single one of them. I was as mesmerized and maybe even fearful of them as the characters in this film. And I also thought that the dialogue that these characters speak suited the situations very well. There were very few false notes in the acting. And I also thought that the main protagonist, Zoe, played by Taylor Russell, was probably the most appropriate protagonist. She's the one you're rooting for the most because, of course, she has things she needs to overcome, particularly shyness, and she's doing something she fears, and you don't want to see her die because she ultimately steps out of her comfort zone. You want to see her succeed. Of course, you don't want to see any of these 6 people die because there really are no bad guys within the group of 6 here. So Escape Room was a much better horror film than I would have expected coming out in early January of a given year, and it gets my rating of a checkout. I do think that if it had tried to distance itself from Saw and the Chernobyl Effect more than it did, it would have been a better movie. But for what it was a good time. I certainly was thrilled, sometimes very scared for the characters, and I think that is ultimately the point of a movie like this.
The possibility of lung cancer can be pretty scary, especially if you're one of approximately 8 million current or former smokers at high risk. That's why SaveByTheScan.org wants you to know that now there's a breakthrough low-dose CT scan that can detect lung cancer early, and it only takes 60 seconds. You stop smoking, now start screening. For an easy quiz to see if you're eligible, visit SaveByTheScan.org. It could save your life. SaveByTheScan.org is brought to you by the American Lung Association's Lung Force Initiative and the Ad Council.
I love those real 6 signs. They're the ones that move me. The thinly blow, neurotic tone, intensify and groove me.
All this and more on Unpopular Music, Saturdays at noon on Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next film I'm going to be reviewing for you is Vice. This is a movie that came out in theaters nationwide on Christmas Day. So because of that fact, I didn't get to review it on my show before joining you guys again. But I did actually list Vice as one of my top 10 films of 2018. I actually put it at number 5. It's not a perfect film, but what it lacks in pacing and narrative structure, it really does make up for by great performances by the likes of Christian Bale, who is brilliant in this movie as Dick Cheney. Who is the basis of this film. I think basically this came out, or rather, it's not based on a book or a newspaper article. This is a film whose story and screenplay were written probably with a lot of intricate research by Adam McKay, who also directed this film. Adam McKay also turned down the opportunity to direct the movie Holmes and Watson, starring Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, to do this film. And considering how Holmes and Watson turned out, that was probably a very good move. That being said, I do think that when Adam McKay and Will Ferrell worked together. They work very well together, and that's where Will Ferrell's best films, for the most part, come together. But in any event, Vice, I think, is a movie that is brilliantly acted, and there might be some political hatred that might have been brought on or motivated by the current controversial Donald Trump administration under which we're all living. And you don't even have to be American to be living under the Donald Trump administration. Basically, what the leader of the free world does has an effect on the world, whether we like it or not. And Vice opens up a lot of previously healing wounds to give us a reminder that even though we are living under a controversial administration, the Bush administration from 2001 to 2009 was also very controversial, but if you can imagine, quite a bit less controversial than the Trump administration. And I'm not going to get too much into it, but this movie focuses exclusively on Dick Cheney, not only his upbringing in his native Wyoming, but also his basic... I've got a phone call coming in. Excuse me. That's one of the downsides of basically... filming a show on my cell phone, but I kind of have to do that. But it shows Dick Cheney both when he was a young boy in Wyoming and also when he worked as a White House intern during the Nixon administration, when he worked under Nixon's economic advisor, Donald Rumsfeld, whose name you'd hear a lot more during the Bush administration. And also you have his working under President Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan before being recruited by President George W. Bush for the role of vice president. And usually when somebody is vice president, it's kind of a do-nothing role, or at least it seems that way to most of the American public who is paying attention during a certain president's reign. But as you might imagine, from 2001 to 2009, Dick Cheney had a lot more power than most vice presidents, probably most especially Mike Pence right now, because honestly, what is Mike Pence doing nowadays? I mean, you see him on TV with Donald Trump during his negotiations with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. He's just kind of sitting there. But Joe Biden was probably more of an active vice president, but in any event, Dick Cheney was probably even more active than that. And as this movie elaborates, that was definitely to a fault. And one term you will hear a lot during this movie is one called unitary executive theory. And unitary executive theory is a theory of the American constitutional law that holds that the president possesses the power to control the entire executive branch. This is a doctrine that's rooted in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which vests the executive power of the United States in the president. And there is disagreement amongst lawyers, politicians, and political scholars about the strength and scope of the doctrine. Some people favor a strongly unitary executive, while others favor a weakly by weakly, I mean not strongly unitary executive. But Dick Cheney seemed to exercise the unitary executive theory, despite the fact that the Constitution dictates that it's the president, not the vice president, who executes the unitary executive theory. But that wasn't the only controversy with Dick Cheney. This movie also details the movement of America into Iraq, the handling of the Valerie Plame affair, Dick Cheney's accidental shooting of Harry Whittington, and also the tension between the two daughters of Dick Cheney over same-sex marriage. One of his daughters, Mary, came out as gay when Cheney was working under President George H.W. Bush, and of course there is some tension, particularly with the Cheneys, both Dick Cheney and Lynn Cheney being conservative. Of course, should you favor gay marriage based on the fact that you have a child who's gay? Of course, a lot of people would say yes, but conservatives and Republicans are usually a no on that, and this movie details the tensions with that belief system and compromising it for one thing or another. And of course, this movie does not pull any punches when it comes to Dick Cheney's life. It's not perfect, but I think that Christian Bale gives a great multifaceted performance that, unlike the film, is not judgmental, and I think that works very well towards the movie's advantage. I also loved Amy Adams as Lynn Cheney. I loved Steve Carell as Donald Rumsfeld, and Sam Rockwell and Tyler Perry give great performances in this movie, as well as George W. Bush and Colin Powell, respectively. It's a movie you might not agree with, but it certainly makes you think, and of course, because it's my top 10 best film of the year, it is a knockout. I loved the acting. I loved what Adam McKay did with the story. Again, it's not perfect, but it's easier to follow than The Big Short, rest assured.
Steven.
Who said that?
Me, down here.
Ugh, what are you, a yellow booger?
I'm a banana slug, Steven.
What are you doing in my room?
I'm your sense of adventure. It's been a long time since we've had an adventure in the forest.
Mom took me to the forest last year.
I'm a slug, Steven. It took me a long time to get here.
You're right. I should get out.
Yeah, the forest is not that far away.
Hey, Mom!
Come to the forest where the more adventurous you lives. Check out discovertheforest.org for cool places nearby. Brought to you by the U.S. Forest Service and the Ad Council.
Every Tuesday at 3, something special happens on Boston Free Radio. Why, it's Toppers with your host, Gil. Toppers, spinning the tunes that today's youth demand. From Justin Bieber to Lady Gaga to the Fleetwoods. And, on occasion, Hoagie Carmichael. If you missed the program, you can check out the archives at Toppers Radio, that's one word, .blogspot.com. Toppers.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke, and now that I've reviewed all the movies I have to review for this show, I do a maximum of 5 every week. I'm going to get into my next segment, and I'm going to make the introduction for that. But first, there are 9 films that I have seen during the holiday break, but I have not yet reviewed on this show. I definitely won't get to all of them next week, but because there's one major film that's coming out in theaters nationwide this coming weekend, that probably guarantees that some of the films that are on this list that I'm tallying as we speak I'm probably going to review them for you next week. But of course, I also have my take on the Oscar nominations, which are going to be announced a week from the date of this show, which is January 22nd, 2019. So I'll be giving you my take on those, and it's going to be a very interesting show. Now on to my final segment of the show, which is what's coming up next. This is a spoken word preview of movies that may or may not be coming out in theaters near you. If they are, whether or not they are, I will let you know. So the biggest film that's coming out in theaters this coming weekend is Glass, which is directed by M. Night Shyamalan and is the sequel to both Unbreakable and Split. Now, Split came out 2 years ago and was the surprise hit of January of 2017, and it also served as a major comeback for M. Night Shyamalan. And the twist at the end of that movie was that it was actually a sequel, or at least took place in the same cinematic universe as Unbreakable, which was M. Night Shyamalan's less auspicious follow-up to The Sixth Sense. But as the years have gone on, Unbreakable has been just as revered in cult status as The Sixth Sense was when it first came out. But it took a while. So Glass has Samuel L. Jackson, Bruce Willis, and James McAvoy reprising their roles from Unbreakable and Split, respectively. And it also features several actors from one of the two movies, including Anya Taylor-Joy reprising her role as the tortured outcast teenager Carol Cook. And you also have Sarah Paulson in this movie as a psychiatrist who is examining the 3 people who are in the Institute for the Criminally Insane. So security guard David Dunn, Bruce Willis's character in this movie, uses his supernatural abilities to track Kevin Wendell Crumb, also known as Mr. Glass, who is a disturbed man who has... Scratch that. That's James McAvoy's character, who is a disturbed man who has 24 personalities. One of them is just called Beast. And also Samuel L. Jackson makes his appearance in this movie as Mr. Glass, and hence the name of the movie. So this is a movie that I'm really looking forward to seeing. I'm trying not to keep my expectations too high, but I will see this movie, and I will let you know exactly what I think of this film when I review it for you next week. There's another film coming out in limited release. It's called The Heiresses, which is about two women named Chela and Chiquita, who are both from wealthy families in Asuncion, which is in South America. And they have been together for over 30 years, but recently their financial situation has worsened, and they begin selling off their inherited possessions. That's as far as I'm going to go, because there's a very lengthy description that I read off of, and I don't have a lot of time, but The Heiresses at least sounds promising, and I will let you know what I think if I see that movie next week. Another film that's coming out in limited release is one called An Acceptable Loss. This is a movie about a former top U.S. security advisor by the name of Elizabeth Lamb, who's played by Tika Sumpter, who is threatened by associates from her dark past, and I guess it's a political espionage movie that stars Tika Sumpter, Jamie Lee Curtis, Ben Tavasoli, and Jeff Hefner. Sounds interesting. I'll see it if it's coming out in the theater near me. If not, well, I will just review one of the other movies that's on my growing list of films that I saw during the holiday break, but I have not reviewed yet. But I will, of course. It's on my list. But anyway, you've been listening to the show Words on Film. This is the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures, and I am your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The views and opinions expressed on Words on Film about movies or otherwise are solely those of your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. That's me, of course. They do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of any employees who are working at the station airing this broadcast or the station as a whole. And as I said previously right after my last break, next week will be the Oscar nominations and also will be the Razzie nominations. So I may dedicate my whole show to going over the nominees, who I think should have been nominated, who I think shouldn't have. It's going to be a fun show, but until then, this is Dan Burke for Words on Film saying I'll see you at the movies.